Let's now turn to our first guest, Craig Mokhiber. Craig is an international human rights lawyer who resigned his position in October as director of the UN Human Rights Office in New York. In his resignation letter, which went viral, Mokhiber charged that, quote, once again, we are seeing a genocide unfolding before our eyes, and the organization that we serve appears powerless to stop it. Craig, it's such an honor to have you with us today. Thank you so much for being with us on the live stream.
It's great to be with you all. Thank you, Nora.
Well, let's begin by having you tell us why you resigned from the UN. I know this is a story that you've told a few times over the last month, but how does and also how does what's happening in Gaza fit the definition of genocide?
Yeah, well, I actually raised my concerns in the late winter, early spring of this year, following a series of atrocities that were happening on the West Bank and leading up to and including the pogrom that occurred in Hawara on the West Bank and a series of Israeli assaults on communities there. And I thought at the time that many in the senior political leadership in the UN were whispering in a situation that deserved a scream. And I was speaking out quite publicly, as I had on human rights situations all around the globe for 32 years at the UN. But this case became a little bit different because there was, as there often is for UN officials who speak out on Israeli violations, an orchestrated campaign by a group of really vicious Israel lobby groups led by some organizations that had been set up specifically for the purpose of harassing UN staff and officials who speak out on Israeli violations. And, distinct from the way things have been handled in the past, there was a kind of wave of trepidation that went across the UN. And instead of standing up on principle, they asked me to remain silent, which is something I didn't want to do. I hadn't been used to doing. I'd been never asked in the past to censor myself. Imagine a UN human rights official being asked not to critique human rights violations committed by a member state. So I entered into a conversation then with the High Commissioner for Human Rights and others, and I said that I thought that we were on a dangerous downward spiral, that a trend had developed over a period of time that was getting worse and worse, whereby there was this kind of fear, this trepidation about doing our job and criticizing violations perpetrated by powerful states and their allies. And this was most obvious when it came to Israel and the United States and a few others, and that the organization was making a mistake by lowering its voice when these attacks by these lobby groups or démarches from Western states took place, and that what we really needed to do was to raise our voice louder, that it was our mandate, after all, to speak truth to power, to take the position of the victim, as Camus told us to do, and that we were empowering this strategy on the part of the enemies of human rights, really, by silencing ourselves whenever that happened, and that I wasn't comfortable with a gag order being put on me after all of those years. And so at that time, I indicated my intention to leave in the coming months. And of course, the situation then got much worse on the ground, both in the West Bank, but obviously beginning in October in Gaza. And that's in October when I penned my letter setting out, I think with great clarity, what I thought was wrong with this dangerous trend in the organization, with its positioning on Palestine generally, where it was falling down and where it needed to change, and especially to get back to the issue of root causes. And as we all know now, that alarm bell on genocide turned out to be horrifically correct, and the situation has only gotten worse since then.
Craig, if I can ask you, you said that you were basically told to keep silent. Sadly, I don't think that will surprise a lot of people, given the state of the discourse in official circles in Israel. But I'm just curious, how does that work? Is it a quiet conversation in a hallway? Is it an email? Is there a paper trail? How is this communicated to you?
This was a kind of panicked series of messages that came in through text apps and through email and so on from senior leadership figures who were first being démarched by the Israeli ambassador, by the Americans. There was a whole sort of media campaign, the usual smear campaign, right? That if you speak up, then you are an anti-Semite, a supporter of terrorism, and so on. So that was making them, I think, very nervous, as it had in the past. And just basically, and this had never happened to me before. I mean, you're talking 32 years, so I was a little surprised at this as well. And I was told that I couldn't speak out on Palestine in particular, and that I couldn't say anything publicly unless it had been issued by the Secretary General or the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but only on this situation. There was no gag order given on other situations.
Wow. We want to get to your analysis of how the situation in Gaza fits the legal definition of genocide. But you were working in the UN Human Rights Office, which of course is one of the key instruments of the UN to raise human rights issues internationally. But there is another office in the United Nations that has a specific role of raising the alarm bell when there is a risk of genocide. And that office is headed by a Kenyan diplomat called Alice Wairimu-Nderitu. And she and her office, her position is the special advisor to the Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. And it is in her mandate, which is given by the Security Council, that she is supposed to monitor situations around the world and raise the alarm where there is a risk of genocide in order to stop genocide from happening. In other words, her job is not to wait until no one disputes there's a genocide and then speak out. Her job is to speak out before there's a genocide. And yet she has remained, and her office have remained silent about genocide. In fact, at the beginning of this situation, she issued a statement taking Israel's side, basically, and supporting of all of Israel's unverified claims. And I want to show you an article that appeared in the Times of London, and Tamara, of course, is always there to help us to show these things. And it says that there is uproar within the United Nations, within UN headquarters, that there are calls on her to resign. There is a petition, a change.org petition that has something like 18,000 signatures calling her on her to do her duty or to resign. And but I want to point to a specific part in this article, which is that at the daily UN briefings, reporters have been asking the representative of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres why Ms. Nderitu has been silent. And the spokesperson for the Secretary General, Stefan Dujarric, says the Secretary General continues to have full confidence in the work of Ms. Nderitu. And of course, by work, he means inaction, because she has done nothing as far as we know. What is going on here?
Well, of course, the Secretary General has full confidence in the work of Alice Nderitu and of the Genocide Prevention Office, because they are following his orders. And that is exactly how that office was designed. I was actually involved in the original discussions about setting up such an office in 2004. So this was during the time of Kofi Annan as Secretary General, and there was going to be a major landmark presentation by Kofi Annan at the Stockholm Forum. So a very, very visible moment at which Kofi Annan wanted to apologize for the failings of the UN in Rwanda and Srebrenica, because you remember that during those genocides, Kofi Annan was the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping, in charge of the UN's peacekeeping presence in both of those places, both of which failed miserably in those horrific assaults. And he came to feel very responsible and guilty about that. So at the time, he had a senior advisor and a speechwriter, a guy named Ed Mortimer, who was quite an extraordinary person, who reached out to me. I happened to be in charge of the New York office at that time. I had since left and came back, but I happened to be in charge of it at that time. And he said, not only does the Secretary General want to apologize, but he wants to make an announcement on what he's going to do to make sure this never happens in the future. So what I said to them was that we had done an analysis in the Human Rights Office about the disconnect between the human rights program, the norms and standards, the monitoring that goes on there on the one hand, and what happens in the peace and security and the Security Council side of the work on the other hand, and explained how that disconnect explained a lot of the failure of the UN's actions when it comes to threats of mass atrocities. This was after an independent special rapporteur, a guy called 𝐓𝐡𝐞 had gone to Rwanda months before the genocide and warned it was unfolding, and was completely ignored by the Security Council, but also by the political offices in the UN. And 6 months later, the machetes were flying and the genocide was underway. And so what we proposed was, let's establish an independent special rapporteur on the prevention of genocide that would be supported by the UN Human Rights Office with all of its monitoring and data capacities and so on, early warning capacities, but would be able to give reports directly to the Security Council to close that gap so that it could act without it being politically controlled. And Kofi Annan went to Stockholm and he announced it exactly as we had laid it out. But then the political side of the House got a hold of it. And they said, no, it can't be an independent rapporteur. It has to be a special advisor in the Secretariat so that we can control it. So it doesn't say something that's going to upset particular member states. And it can't have access to the Security Council. It can report to the Secretary General, and we'll see about briefings from time to time. And it can't be supported by the Human Rights Office. They said genocide is essentially a political question, not a human rights question. So it's going to be supported by the Secretariat in New York, the political side of the House. So by design, it is a weak, non-independent, politically controlled office. Yes, Alison Dorito should resign. That's a massive failing in her case. But her resignation won't fix the problem. The problem is this politicization of human rights questions by the Secretary General in New York. It's not the first time. We have a special advisor on children in armed conflict that gets data from the Human Rights Office and others every year about violations regarding children in armed conflict in Israel and Palestine, but is silenced by the 38th floor, by the Secretary General's office, and by powerful member states, and can be silenced because it's not an independent office. It's a unit of the Secretariat set up precisely to be a politically controlled entity. And so it is with Alison Dorito. That office, the Genocide Office, I mean, the previous inhabitants were prominent human rights leaders who tried to do something meaningful with it. People like Adama Dieng, a Senegalese, prominent Senegalese human rights lawyer, Francis Deng, a prominent Sudanese human rights lawyer, Juan Mendez from Argentina, another prominent human rights lawyer. But they were so constrained by those offices that you saw through time it became less and less relevant. And the appointment of Alison Dorito, who didn't come from the international human rights community. She's a political person, a conflict resolution profile appointed by Guterres in 2020, shows you that it's just an over time a diminishing of any capability that would have existed in an office. I think that office should be dismantled. Its staff should be assigned elsewhere, and that needs to be moved into the independent part of the UN Human Rights Program, where you have special rapporteurs, commissions of inquiry, people who can actually act with principle without being controlled by the Secretary General or the political office.
So it's very much like having a smoke alarm, a genocide alarm, but with no batteries in it.
It's like having a smoke alarm with no batteries that's locked in the closet, so it can't make any noise in any case. And that's worse than nothing at all, in my view, because it means that the alarm, when the alarm is rung, is going to be a political decision based upon triangulation between where the powers are. And if it's an ally of the United States, for example, there's very little hope that you will see a principled approach.
Craig, I'm just looking at some breaking news here. The UN Security Council, this is according to Reuters, just approved a toned-down bid to boost humanitarian aid in Gaza, calling for urgent steps, quote, to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities after a week of delays in negotiations to avoid a veto by the U.S. What is the significance of this very watered down resolution? Does it have any bite? Will it stop the genocide that Israel is continuing?
Yeah, it hurts to hear that news. I knew that was coming. They were scheduled to meet at 11:30, just as we were getting organized for this show. The U.S. has been delaying a vote on an earlier draft resolution for over a week, trying to buy time for Israel as it tried to water down and negotiate the text. This text, that as it's been adopted, and I haven't seen the final version, but if it's the one that I was seeing this morning, is bad news. You know, the original text here was supposed to include a suspension of hostilities. It was supposed to include a condemnation of violations of humanitarian law. It was supposed to have a UN aid monitor included in it. And overnight, we learned that the UN, after all of these efforts it delayed, during which, by the way, thousands more have been injured or died or you know, under the rubble or killed or by the Israelis, and instead, you know, they created this watered down is a kind term. It's been hollowed out. It's not going to have any meaningful impact. We got no suspension of hostilities. The UN aid monitor is turned into a special coordinator, which is a very similar mechanism to what I described with these special advisor offices, politically controlled. Look at the UN special coordinator for the occupied territories, which is, I mean, it's another UN institution that should be dissolved, because it does not take a principled position. If you just listen to the statements of the current special coordinator, you'll know that this is an office that is not on the side of international law or justice or human rights. So the idea is to appoint a special coordinator, not a UN aid monitor, that could actually facilitate more humanitarian aid in there. And the problem with this is it gets, you know, the US has engaged in a lot of what I've called fig leaf harvesting. And this is another fig leaf that allows them to avoid domestic and global condemnation for its complicity in the genocide in Gaza. They will spin it as an opportunity to increase humanitarian aid, and it may increase humanitarian aid by a slight amount, but not to the more, you know, before this assault began, Gaza, because of the siege, was relying on 500 trucks a week. Now it's been entirely destroyed. So these really are fig leaves. It's going to be holding
500 trucks a day.
Sorry, 500 trucks
yeah,
a day.
yeah, and now they're at less than 10% of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So these are bad gestures, and it also could mean that since the Security Council has acted, they can't use the United for Peace resolution in the General Assembly to get the world to vote on a resolution to again isolate the U.S. and show that it is contradicting the position of the entire globe on these issues. It's a resolution that was drafted behind closed doors, essentially overnight, between the U.S. and the UAE, and in direct consultation with the Israelis. And we knew for days now that what they were trying to achieve was to get out, especially the suspension of hostilities, to change it into language that basically means, and this is the way it was being described before the text was drafted, that Israel can decide when an appropriate moment has arrived at which it's okay to let up on the hostilities. And one has to ask, how do you have meaningful humanitarian assistance as the bombs are dropping and the snipers are shooting and the genocide is continuing? It's less than zero, in my view.
Craig, let's talk about, we're using this word genocide, and you, of course, have called what's happening in Gaza genocide, but you're not alone. As early as October 13th, Palestinian human rights groups called on world governments to urgently intervene to protect the Palestinian people against genocide on the 15th of October. So we're talking about just a week after the events of October 7th. 800 scholars and practitioners of international law and genocide studies, including prominent Holocaust scholars, signed a statement, quote, to sound the alarm about the possibility of the crime of genocide being perpetrated by Israeli forces against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. You've mentioned the UN's independent human rights mechanism, the special rapporteurs. They have issued several similar calls, including one warning about, quote, a genocide in the making in Gaza. And of course, as Nora noted, you wrote, in October, once again, we are seeing a genocide unfolding before our eyes. So this warning is going out from many, many people. But let's break it down very simply. What is genocide, and how is what's happening in Gaza genocide?
Well, and note that that warning is coming out not from editorial writers, but from human rights lawyers, genocide and Holocaust experts, people who spend their days and nights working on these specific questions. And that's because what has struck us all so much is the degree to which the Israeli stated intent and their actions on the ground mirror so horrifically the specific language in the UN Genocide Convention, because this is a legal question. It's not a question of opinion, as it's often projected in Western media, at least. The Genocide Convention sets out very specifically the acts of genocide and the required intent of genocide. And we know the acts include killing, serious harm, causing bodily harm, and this thing of deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring out the destruction of a group in whole or in part. And the intention that's required is an intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. So, we've rarely seen a case where all of those things are ticked, right? These acts are being perpetrated by a state against another specific group, in this case, Palestinians. It's not like they're just, this is happening to everybody inside Israel and Palestine. It's being directed against Palestinians as a group. You have large-scale killing. Right now, we're at 20,000 confirmed deaths. People exterminated in a matter of just a few weeks. I mean, the level of murder is astounding. 8,000 or 9,000 children, 6,000 women, 5,000 men, countless whole families, multi-generational families, exterminated and erased from the public register. More than 50,000, probably more than 60,000 now injured, and many thousands more still under the rubble, dying of disease, and now, by the way, dying also of starvation. This is the wholesale slaughter of an imprisoned civilian population. Remember, Gaza is this large open-air prison, and it's really horrifically shooting fish in a barrel. So this is extermination. Whole neighborhoods razed to the ground, massive ordnance on densely populated civilian areas, homes, refugee camps, hospitals, clinics, ambulances, schools, humanitarian facilities, all of that. And then the second point in the convention, serious harm, physical and mental. Okay, thousands have been wounded, maimed, denied medical care, denied food, water, medicine, shelter, constant bombing and sniper attacks. People widowed, orphaned, exposed to disease, terrorized every day with these explosions. Clearly, that has been ticked. Then you've got this thing which is often more challenging, but here is so clear that it's just caused genocide scholars to gasp, which is this line in the convention that talks about deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. It's a uniquely clear case, right? 2.3 million civilians interned in Gaza by Israel, most of them poor, most of them food insecure already before October, most of them children, most of them already refugees. It's imposed a closure on Gaza since 2005, deliberately restricting food and water and sanitation and medicine and construction and free movement, all the elements of a decent life, and then periodically launching these military attacks against them. And of course, since October, Israel has made the siege total. So, intentionally, and saying that they're doing it as they're doing it, cutting off all food and water, fuel, all the essentials necessary, and another grave breach of international humanitarian law. 2 million women, children, and men forcibly displaced since then. And, as you've noted in the past, Israel has not been shy about the deliberate nature of their collective punishment of the civilian population when they do these things, putting the population on a diet, mowing the lawn, these kinds of horrific statements. They've destroyed homes and schools and hospitals and churches and mosques and courthouses, food production, civilian infrastructure, refugee camps, UN facilities, cemeteries, crops. And so here you have a situation where you could not have a clearer case of this Article 2C of the Genocide Convention on creating these kinds of conditions of life. But there is nothing more striking, Ali, than the question of intent in this case. Because what I've been saying since October, well, first, the International Court of Justice says you can infer intent from conduct because it's often very hard to prove genocidal intent. And so certainly, after 75 years of these ethnic purges carried out by Israel, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and now in Gaza, that's already compelling evidence that what they're intending to do now in Gaza is another ethnic purge. And I think that's been proven. But even beyond that, you don't have to infer, because there has been such a climate of impunity granted to Israel for decades, underwritten by the United States, the United Kingdom, some European countries as well. This has led to a situation where they believe they will not be held accountable. And as such, they are declaring their genocidal intent openly, publicly, and on the record since the beginning, right? This is not one of the usual cases where I've been saying, where you have to dig through dusty government archives to find communications that prove intent. They are saying it publicly. And there are organizations now that are compiling all of the genocidal statements of Israeli leaders that number now in the hundreds, right? This is very rare in cases of genocide. And here we're talking about, we're not talking about some occasional rogue soldier. We're talking about the Israeli president, the prime minister, cabinet officials, senior military officials, these think tanks affiliated with the government, not to mention Israeli media, dehumanizing Palestinians, which is an element of this, that the people in Gaza are animals, subhuman, Nazis, terrorists, cancer, ants, vermin. This is all very familiar language to people who work on genocide. And then declaring what their intention is, that they will wipe out all of Gaza. They will not distinguish between civilians and combatants, because there are no civilians in these genocidal statements. To raise Gaza to the ground, to reduce it to rubble, to bury the Palestinians alive, and explicitly to carry out another Nakba, the original genocide perpetrated against the Palestinians. And of course, we've all seen that Netanyahu himself has repeatedly, not just once, invoked this biblical verse on the Amalek that commands that the entire population be wiped out, that none be spared, men, women, children, suckling babies, and livestock, right? In other words, they have committed themselves to a genocide and stated the intent clearly. And the thing here that's different, Ali, about just bad statements made by leaders during wars, for example, is that Israel actually has the capacity to carry out genocide in all of Palestine. They've constructed this powerful apparatus of repression. It's firmly entrenched in all of Palestine and Israel. It includes military occupation and assault forces, abusive police contingents, ruthless intelligence agencies, walls and fences and barbed wire, all of the advanced monitoring and surveillance technologies, drones, autonomous weapons, violent armed settlers armed by the Israeli government as well, this whole system of repressive laws, apartheid laws in the country. So all Palestinians and all of historic Palestine are entirely subjugated, entirely vulnerable, forcibly contained and interned, defenseless except for efforts of the resistance, and subject to regular attacks both by Israeli military forces and by the settlers. They have the means to carry out genocide, and they're deploying all of those means as we speak. But
Craig,
the last piece on this, let me just finish, is that genocide scholars have these series of 10 steps that indicate genocide. All of them have been ticked off since October in one of the most clearly manifest cases of genocide that we've ever seen.
Craig, I have a couple of, I have many questions, more than we have time for, but there's a couple I want to put to you. One is, I think you've addressed it in a way in the answer you gave me, but I want to put it to you more explicitly. It's clear that what's happening now in Gaza is genocide. Do you think that the same description applies to what is happening currently right now in the West Bank?
I think it's the same genocide. So I think there's a specific set of military acts that Israel is carrying out to facilitate genocide in the Gaza portion of Palestine. But it's not another genocide happening on the West Bank. It's an extension of genocide that's happening on the West Bank. So the attacks on villages, the wholesale ethnic cleansing of many villages just since October, but also earlier in the year that I was originally complaining about at the UN, pogroms by settlers, armed, backed up, sometimes physically accompanied by the Israeli army in carrying out those things on the West Bank, dispossession, settlement activity. All of these things are elements of the broader genocide, which also, by the way, includes persecution of Palestinians who live inside the Green Line into what is now Israel, and obviously in Jerusalem, occupied Jerusalem as well. So it's all a part of the same genocide that's being perpetrated there. It's not, there's often an attempt to try to separate these things because of geographic separation, which is by design. But I see it as I see it as evidence of the same genocide that's being perpetrated. The tactics are slightly different, they're very different, but the end result is the same. Look at the specific acts that are taking place in the West Bank and the stated intent of Israeli officials, and you can only conclude that that is a part of the genocide that we see unfolding in Gaza.
That's an extremely important clarification. I hadn't heard that addressed so clearly before, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
There's a couple of other things I want to ask you about. Part of the Genocide Convention, or let me say, the Genocide Convention also defines incitement to genocide and complicity in genocide as crimes under the convention. And I want to talk about incitement and complicity, because we've seen, I want to show you a story that we've been reporting on over the past few weeks. We've seen over the past months this claim coming from Israel that Hamas and Palestinian fighters used systematic mass rape as a weapon of war. This is a very inflammatory claim for which Israel has presented no credible evidence, which I don't think that will surprise viewers of the Electronic Intifada live stream or our readers, because we report on it, but it may surprise many people who watch mainstream media. And there have been other claims that have been totally debunked, whether it is the 40 beheaded Jewish babies or the baby baked in an oven. That never happened either. There are also claims. I'm currently working on a story that we hope to publish in the next few days, pointing out how other claims where Israeli officers claimed that they found Israeli civilians tied together and shot were also false. What role do these sorts of claims play in a genocide? And is it complicity when, say, the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and other international and foreign officials are repeating these? And I'll point out here, for example, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has also repeated Israeli claims as if they are fact. Without calling, I have never heard the Secretary General call for independent investigations into these allegations, whether it's of mass rape or beheaded babies or whatever other story Israel is telling. Is this what is meant by incitement to genocide and complicity in genocide in the UN Convention?
Yeah, so let me take them separately. First on the issue of incitement, there's been a lot of incitement. And there is no doubt in my mind that Western media companies, especially in the United States, and politicians, especially in the United States, have actually participated in incitement in these cases. I'm reminding people all the time that you can be held accountable also for incitement. It's a separate crime. And indeed, we know in Nuremberg that people were held accountable for incitement in the genocide that took place against European Jews. We also know in Rwanda that the Rwanda tribunal held several individuals accountable for media figures for their incitement. But these lessons seem to have not been learned by media personalities in the West, who are committing these same crimes of parroting non-critically, allegations being made by the government of Israel and its proxies that are not credible on their face, without any methodology of vetting and what it is that they are communicating. So there's a lot of that going on. Secondly, the issue of complicity. Complicity is a separate crime under the Genocide Convention. And as you know, the US government officials are have an action against them by the Center for Constitutional Rights for their complicity, as they should, because this is a very specific crime. If you so you see the United States, for example, the U.S. has other obligations. It has obligations of prevention, which it has clearly failed on. It's done nothing to prevent the genocide that's taking place there. It also has obligations under the Geneva Conventions to ensure respect for the conventions vis-a-vis other parties over which it has influence, in this case, Israel. But in this case, they've gone far beyond that mere breach, and they've entered into legal complicity because they have been actively providing economic and military and intelligence and diplomatic support to Israel while it is engaged in its unlawful actions in Gaza. You have official state institutions, the podiums of the National Security Council and the State Department and the White House and the Pentagon, dedicating themselves to disseminating Israeli propaganda for war, dehumanization of Palestinians, justifications for war crimes and crimes against humanity. We all heard them parroting justifications for attacking hospitals in Gaza. That is active complicity. Not to mention the fact that the U.S. has deployed its veto now multiple times to prevent Security Council calls for a ceasefire, after which many more thousands were killed. Behind the scenes, you have the U.S. using its diplomatic resources to pressure UN actors to be silent on Israeli atrocities, including the human rights mechanisms of the UN. So here, you have to have legal accountability. And these fig leaves that the State Department has been trying to harvest with these, comments by Blinken and Biden, like securing a trickle of aid, or saying that we have asked the Israelis to respect international law, these kinds of, transparent fig leaves. These are not going to relieve legal accountability for the United States, because it has continued its acts of arming and financing and protecting the crimes as they're being committed. The rape.
So what does that mean? What is legal accountability? I mean, there have been calls, for example, the journalist Sam Husseini has made the point of saying that no country has invoked the Genocide Convention, and he's saying that that they should do so, that any country can do so. What does it mean to invoke the Genocide Convention, and why has no one done it?
I think what Sam Husseini is talking about is invoking the Genocide Convention in the World Court, in the International Court of Justice, the High Court of the UN, right? Because the Genocide Convention has a specific provision that mentions the International Court of Justice and says that any state can bring a claim for genocide or genocide prevention to get initial orders from the court that would, force certain things to stop or certain things to happen. Now, that's a state-to-state claim. It's not individual criminal accountability, but it would be very important. States should bring it. There are conversations going on now to see about getting one or more states to bring a claim before the ICJ for that purpose. I don't know why it has taken so long and what the hesitation is. There are theories out there, which I don't want to reinforce because I don't know if they're true. But that is definitely something that there's a lot of advocacy now to try to get one or more states to bring a claim before the International Court of Justice, the World Court. Now, separate from that is the problem of the International Criminal Court, where you can bring cases against individuals like Netanyahu, for example, Joe Biden, for example, for individual criminal accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. Those are all covered by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The problem there is that you've got a politically corrupted prosecutor in Karim Khan, who has demonstrated that he is unable or unwilling to implement impartially the statute of the court. And this has been very clearly indicated by the rapidity with which he acted on the encouragement of the West to bring action against Russia in the Ukraine. And the fact that he has dragged his feet and delayed and obstructed action on Palestine, in spite of the fact that there's a case before the court for years now that was already there when he was appointed as the prosecutor. He needs to step down or be replaced because he's dragging what little legitimacy the court has had down with him. And they need to have really a complete turnaround and pick up these claims, because you have 5 states that are bringing action for genocide, for the Israeli genocide in Palestine in the International Criminal Court, but action will depend on whether or not this prosecutor is willing to take action. Now, there's a third channel here, because what we're talking about are crimes of universal jurisdiction, which means that court action for these crimes can be brought in any court anywhere. You know, there's nothing to stop a European court or courts around the world from bringing cases against individuals that are perpetrators of genocide or complicity in genocide or incitement to genocide, and they should. And I think we will see some of that activity eventually. But this is an obligation of states under international law to bring action to hold perpetrators of genocide accountable. By the way, there is this obligation of prevention as well. And many of the failings that I see in international institutions, including the UN, is that they've adopted a rhetorical device, and you should listen for it when you hear statements where someone says, what about, you know, there have been all these warnings about genocide unfolding in Palestine, and then you'll have a UN official will say, well, only a court can determine if there is genocide, so we can't really say anything about that. It's utter nonsense. That is a rhetorical device that was invented in the halls of the UN specifically to avoid having to pronounce on genocide. And the problem with that is if you wait for a court to take a decision, you have already failed on the legal obligations in the Convention of prevention.
Yeah, and in fact, the security, I mean, just to go back to the special advisor, Ms. Nderitu, her mandate from the Security Council, the office that you were involved in creating, is to monitor and advise the Security Council or the Secretary General through the Security Council, or rather to advise the Security Council through the Secretary General where there is a risk of genocide. In other words, it's her job to say, okay, nobody has determined 100% that there's a genocide here, but based on the available information, I think there's a risk of genocide. But they're not even doing that.
That's absolutely right. And that is a very clear illustration of why that office, I think, needs to be dissolved. Because if you have this kind of ineffective institution that gives people an excuse, that gives member states an excuse to say, we've set up this mechanism and we're doing the best we can, and yet it is so politically controlled that it does not function, it's better not to have it. It's better to resort to the independent work of special rapporteurs like Francesca Albanese and the commissions of inquiry, those independent bodies that are not politically constrained by powerful states in the West. But that's the whole idea is prevention. That's the idea of the convention. It's the idea of setting up that office. It's the idea of prevention. And so that's a horrific failure. You can line up that office and the ICC office and pretty much across the board the failings of the Secretary General's office and see where we are in this genocide.
So where do Palestinians have any recourse at this point? Who and what is going to step in to stop this?
Well, they have the support of the majority of member states in the United Nations and have the support of the majority of the human beings in the world. The level of solidarity with the Palestinian people before and during this genocide is overwhelming compared to the opposition. What they don't have is institutions of the state in the West and international institutions on the political side. My critiques of the UN, I always point out, are of the political side of the house. It's the political leadership, it's the intergovernmental bodies. It's not, by the way, the independent human rights mechanisms that I think are fantastic. It's not the many human rights and humanitarian workers on the ground, the 138 plus UNRWA workers who've been murdered by Israel together with their families. I mean, these people are doing heroic things and paying a very high cost. But it is the political leadership of those institutions that have become compromised intentionally by political pressure from the United States and from the UK and from much of Europe in particular. But there are, I mentioned universal jurisdiction, right? Those are possibilities in courts anywhere to pursue individual accountability. I don't have a lot of faith in official institutions. I mean, the governments in the United States and Europe are so absolutely captured by political action committees, by the APACs of the world, by the arms manufacturers, by technology companies, all who have a stake in supporting genocide, that I don't see anytime soon a principled position coming out of the governments of the US or the UK or the European Union that's been absolutely shameless during this genocide. But where I see hope is in the massive movements of civil society that have come together with unparalleled levels of solidarity and Jewish principled Jewish voices, Muslim voices, Christian voices, agnostics, human rights defenders, peace activists, ordinary people from all over who are coming together at great risk of persecution, of being smeared as terrorist supporters of anti-Semites, of losing their positions in universities, of being beaten and arrested by police, and nevertheless rising up in their thousands, their tens of thousands, their hundreds of thousands, ultimately their millions around the world, to denounce what's happening and to demand accountability. That's where the hope is. And that movement is growing everywhere, in the global north and in the global south. Even in the US, where there's so much repression against human rights defenders who dare to talk about Palestine. Even in Germany, where there's so much repression against minorities and against human rights defenders and people who are standing up to speak. And there's something different. So there's something is breaking through now. And that's where I see the change coming. And it's going to come from civil disobedience, from massive demonstrations, from boycotts, making companies pay an economic cost through divestment, through sanctions, through the growing anti-apartheid movement. You know, I'm old enough to have been involved in the international human rights movement during apartheid in South Africa. And I remember that right up through the 1980s, apartheid in South Africa was supported by the United States government, by many European governments. And what changed it were movements in civil society, churches and synagogues and ordinary people who made it impossible for the shameful policies of those Western governments to continue, ultimately isolating the apartheid regime in South Africa until the South African people were freed from the yoke of apartheid. The same thing can happen in Palestine. And we are up against a brick wall of propaganda, of media companies that are all in for the genocide. Little cracks are opening up there, but there's a lot of work to be done yet to continue that. But somehow, in spite of all of that, the majority of the people in the world are not only horrified by and in opposition to genocide, apartheid, settler colonialism, persecution in Palestine, but are mobilizing around it and are speaking up and are taking action. That's an enormous well of power that can be accessed to end what has been a horrific policy of genocide. I just, when I'm talking to people who are not experts, I say just very clear, you don't have to understand complicity or anything else. The United States and Israel and the United Kingdom and some European countries are committing genocide together, because Israel couldn't do this without the money, the arms, the diplomatic and political cover, the intelligence support that is provided by these Western countries led by the United States. There has to be accountability, legal accountability. There also has to be political and economic accountability, and that can come from the people.
Craig Mokhiber, thank you so much for being with us today on the live stream and illuminating all of these really, essential questions that that need to be asked and how to move forward. We're so grateful for the work that you do, and we'd love to have you back on as soon as possible. Thank you so much, Craig.
No, it's my pleasure. And thank you for all the great work that Electronic Intifada is doing. It's independent media that is the game changer here, and you guys are doing a great job. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.